Hello and welcome back to another Warcraft video. So today we're going to be covering some of the, well, top 8 reasons why I think that the Warlords of Draenor dungeons are really awesome. Now, one little thing before we get into this video, though, there are 7 new dungeons and then Upper Blackrock Spire is there as a revamp. Now, while I think that the quality and stuff like that of these dungeons is absolutely fantastic, that is absolutely no excuse for the fact that there are only 7 new dungeons in terms of art assets and 8 in total in terms of playable endgame dungeons. There absolutely should be more. I remember back in the day, well, you know, we got a lot more dungeons, frankly. Now, one good bit of news is that Blizzard said that there is a good chance and, you know, a strong possibility that they will add some more in future patches in Warlords of Draenor. They said it's the sort of thing that they're definitely actively considering, so hopefully they do that. But anyway, with all that said, let's move on to the points. Now, coming in at number 8, we have the setting and the lore of the dungeons. Yes, these do not affect gameplay mechanics, and gameplay mechanics are far more important, which is why they'll be higher in the video. But it's totally worth mentioning the setting and the lore, so I really do feel like the new dungeons are far more appealing than a lot of the Pandaria ones, and even just some of the Cataclysm ones even. So for the most part, they are very much related to the events that you do while you're questing. So for an example, you'll be questing outside places like Auchindoun and Bloodmaw slag mines, and what'll happen is you'll be sort of introduced via quests to the threat that you'll be dealing with in those dungeons. Then the dungeons themselves often are tied into the storyline that you're doing while you're questing. That is, of course, the normal affair in World of Warcraft. But you know what? It's just pulled off far better here than it previously was. And yeah, okay, maybe this isn't a new shiny thing, but certainly it's something that's well executed. Now, also, the dungeons are often easily spotted locations in the world. This just kind of makes them feel familiar and grounded, which is really important. And I know that that was really definitely the case in Mists of Pandaria and prior expansions, but it's just something here that really works. I think everything is kind of just ingrained into one global story of Warlords of Draenor, which works out quite well. The story itself doesn't have a massive scope or anything like that, but it is quite focused and refined, and the benefits of that are definitely seen in dungeons. So for an example, in Shadowmoon Valley, you deal with the Shadowmoon clan. In Talador, you deal with the Shadow Council shenanigans in Auchindoun. Then in Gorgrond, you deal with both the Iron Horde and the Plant People that are featured in Grimrail Depot, the Iron Docks, and the Everbloom. You enter the Bloodmaw slag mines after having fought ogres in Frostfire Ridge, and then finally the Arakoa dungeons actually sort of feed off some of the stuff that's going on in the Spires of Iraq. Overall, it's just really cohesive, and it feels like you're doing a thing in the world, I suppose. I don't know why I'm feeling this more in the Warlords dungeons than I have been in other expansions, but there's just something about the overall quality and how that ties into a nice, concise, and well-done story, and that just works. I suppose this is more just indicative of what happens when you have high quality across the board in terms of the quests, the zones, and the dungeons, because they all kind of tie in together. Okay, so at number 7 we have the art assets of these various dungeons. Now I know this does slightly tie into point number 8, but don't worry, we will be getting into more mechanic-based things in a minute. But anyway, I just wanted to say that these are certainly some of the most visually impressive dungeons that Blizzard have created, in my opinion. Like the zones, each dungeon looks and feels really different, and each art palette from dungeon to dungeon is a massive change, which is great, and this really does help to fend off the visual boredom that inevitably will happen when you repeat content. I've been doing dungeons since the start of the beta, and providing I'm with a slightly less brain-dead group than usual, I do still have quite a lot of fun with them, and they don't particularly get boring. The only dungeons that are similar are perhaps Grimrail Depot and the Iron Docks, but honestly, I think we'll let that one slide because they both fit within the excellent Iron Horde motif. But yeah, just overall, they look really nice. However, despite how good they look, it is absolutely no excuse for the fact that there's maybe only 2/3 as many as you would expect. I think there should be 10 dungeons, maybe 11 or 12. Unfortunately, we're at 8 with only 7 of them being new. But hey, at least they look pretty nice. Okay, so coming in at number 6, we have the point that there is no faffing about with Warlords of Draenor dungeons. Now what does that mean? Well, there's no waiting for annoying bastards like the panda guy at the Siege of the New Zhao Temple, which basically I think everyone wanted to stab in the eye. Oh, and that guy at the end of Stormstout Brewery as well. I just wish he would shut up talking about his bloody hops so we could get on with killing things. But yes, in general, the dungeons do have great lore behind them, but thankfully, there's also no repeats of, say, the Culling of Stratholme, where you basically had 5 minutes of chatter before you were allowed to do anything. Also, unlike the Culling of Stratholme, they don't make you hold the hand of an NPC, and they don't tie you down to the speed of some sort of NPC. Overall, just a lot of that gumph is gone. You go into a dungeon, you've got a bunch of bosses to kill, you go and you kill them. In general, Blizzard don't really get in your way, and that certainly is nice because honestly, it really does grind my gears when I'm going through Siege of New Shao Temple, and it's like, oh hey, no, we need a complete change of pace. Now we're going to be sitting here throwing pots of amber at a thing. And just in general, when they do things like that, I get why they do them, you know, they think that, oh, that'll break up the content, but ultimately, it ends up just being a bit more annoying, and yeah, just all those little small things that annoyed me basically do not appear here, and that's pretty cool. Another point is that while I did, for an example, enjoy the Oculus, it's pretty darn clear that a lot of people didn't, and I can confirm that they are not pulling any vehicle shenanigans or new ability sets or anything like that. It's pretty much traditional you going in and using the mechanics of your class to deal with any of those problems. Basically, my point is that when you go into a dungeon, you're there to kill stuff. You're not there to be lectured to or anything like that. Now, there is one small exception, and that's the start of Auchindoun, in which you do have to just wait for an NPC to open a door, but after that, it's pretty much, you know, going at your own pace, and that little start bit doesn't take too long anyway. And at number 5, we have engaging trash. So this is something that sort of surprised me. Now, in general, I am not a massive fan of crazy amounts of trash. I think we all remember things like, say, you know, the Kor'kron Dark Shaman trash, and we all perhaps shudder. Well, the good news about the Warlords of Draenor trash is that, for the most part, some of it's quite engaging, actually. So, for an example, in the Iron Docks, there's trash that involves, like, throwing these little Iron Stars, the Iron Star things around, and there's some other trash that involves you kind of moving behind some blocks to avoid cannon volleys and things like that. And it's actually pretty fun. And also, while you may think that's completely pointless, it actually teaches you one of the mechanics from the final boss, which is pretty cool, especially with the whole, you know, avoiding the cannon volleys. Now, speaking of dungeons actually teaching you things via trash, in the Everbloom and in Auchindoun, I think especially, the trash does a fantastic job of teaching you elements of upcoming boss fights. So for an example, in Auchindoun, the second boss summons a whole bunch of adds. Now, some of the abilities that are done by those adds are taught to you in the trash that's leading up to the second boss. And for the third boss of Auchindoun, you actually deal with these little demon guys. Now, those demons later on are summoned in by the third boss, and it just provides a sort of nice and easy way to educate you as to the mechanics. Now, a really good example is actually in the Everbloom for the second boss. Now, the second boss is against a council fight with 3 very distinct looking bosses. And each 3 of those bosses has got their own unique ability. Now, on your way up to those guys, you'll actually fight trash that are basically smaller versions of the bosses, and they will teach you some of the main mechanics from the fight, so that you just sort of intuitively know what to do. They really have been doing this quite a lot. Now, also, you know, some trash does teach you things, but there's other trash which is just interesting, because maybe the mobs do a cool charge, or there's just some cool little mechanic in there. For an example, in Upper Blackrock Spire, there's these grunts, and these grunts put down a banner, and that banner over time will have this radius that increases. Now, if you destroy the banner before the radius gets massive, you're fine, but if you just let that radius increase, then soon enough it will pull any other mobs within that radius. So that's a really cool bit of trash. In Grimrail Depot, there's these like grunt guys who will pick a sort of direction, they'll charge in that direction, so you have to avoid it. And just in general, there's engaging trash, and I was really surprised that Blizzard were able to convince me that a lot of the trash was good. Now, I do want to say that in some places there is too much trash, but at least in general, you know, the trash is more engaging than what I found in the Mop Heroics. However, a part of that may just be because of the current difficulty tuning, which is apparently a little bit overtuned. It actually does make it so that some of those trash mechanics do matter a little bit. Okay, so coming in at number 4, we have challenge modes. Now, this might seem a little bit strange, but there is one big change they've actually made. So what they're going to be doing with challenge modes is, of course, the usual stuff with your transmog item and your mount. But the kind of new shiny thing that's going on for Warlords of Draenor is that there will be a quest. Now, I don't know if this is a daily or a weekly quest, and I don't know what the kind of drop rate from the quest is, but essentially it will allow you to run challenge modes a certain amount of times per day or week, whatever, to get LFR quality gear. Now do remember that LFR is intended to be the thing that some people do after normal dungeons, and they don't expect raiders to partake in LFR, and similarly they don't expect LFR people to take part in heroic dungeons or raids or anything like that. Now basically this is pretty cool because it means that you can get better than heroic dungeon quality stuff by doing harder dungeons, so a little bit like how it kind of was in prior expansions. I think that really is a good thing, actually. You know, I did enjoy the challenge modes of Mists of Pandaria. I think that completing them on a gold medal was certainly tricky enough, but just completing them on their own wasn't particularly hard. However, it did feel close to the sort of mythic dungeon difficulty that I think that a lot of people have asked for. Another cool thing as well is that LFR isn't going to be unlocked for a few weeks. Now this means that players who are able to get into these challenge mode dungeons early are going to be able to get a bit of an early leg up with gear. And I think that's totally cool because it's rewarding, you know, skill and effort with gear, which is always something that I'm, you know, in approval of. Coming up at number 3, we have the fact that bosses actually teach you how to be a better player. Now I know that of course bosses generally are designed to do stuff like this in dungeons, but just with the way that things are currently working with the difficulty level and just the style of the mechanics, I've got to say that the bosses in Warlords are certainly doing a very good job of keeping me and other people on our toes. Now, when I talk about bosses that teach you, I'm basically more referring to the simple bosses that are there. The next point will cover all bosses in general, but this is just about some of the more simple and readable bosses that actually do have mechanics that matter. So, yes, a lot of the bosses involve, you know, switching to a pack of ads, interrupting things, moving away from things, and just the simple basics, the core competencies of being a half-decent player. And, you know, if you're going to be doing heroic dungeons, maybe even a few challenge modes or something, which of course you might be doing if you want to raid because there's the gear incentive, then this is going to act as training for some players. So I just wanted to go through some examples. In the Skyreach you've got the very first boss who does a fantastic job of challenging just your positional skills and your planning and stuff like that. Then the first boss in the Shadowmoon Burial Grounds actually does a really great job of just throwing you in an ultra stressful situation and letting you deal with it. I thought that was really cool, and yeah, certainly pretty cool. Though it's maybe not the most readable boss, so it maybe doesn't deserve to be in here because it is quite complicated in comparison to some of the other bosses, but still, it's cool. You've also got boss 2 of the Everbloom. That's a really well done boss. It's simple enough, but again, it teaches you core mechanics. In Auchindoun, the very first boss is actually great because essentially he throws down a shield and then he does an AoE and you have to stand behind the shield. And while that's all going on, there's stuff that you don't want to stand on the floor. Again, that's really doing a good job of teaching you how to not be shit. And then the third boss of Auchindoun actually does a great job of teaching people to balance their DPS between the boss himself and then between various mobs, and also it teaches mob prioritization. There's these like purple imps that do this hard-casted fireball thingy that really hurts. You need to interrupt it, and you also need to kill them. It's just going to teach people the idea of, hey, this is a very important ad, you must kill it. And then I think the 5th boss in Upper Blackrock Spire does a very good job of just getting people to move. I just think that overall this emphasis on strong mechanics that are clearly visible and understandable is great, and it just reinforces the basics. I hope that they don't nerf things too much from the current beta difficulty. I think obviously there are some nerfs that need to be made, because they are pretty tricky at the minute for some people, and especially in pickup groups. But if they nerf these too much, then what's going to happen is you get into the situation where these very sort of interesting but simple and understandable mechanics essentially mean nothing, and if they mean nothing, people will learn nothing, and it just sets us off in a very bad path. I think Pandaria Heroics didn't really do a good job of teaching anyone anything, and in Warlords they absolutely have an opportunity to teach players a lot about how to just be a good player when it comes to the basics. Okay then, coming in at number 2 we have the fact that the bosses are excellent in pretty much every regard. So essentially nearly every single individual boss that you fight is really cool. Now, first of all, each boss basically feels super unique. None of the fights have got too much overlap or anything like that. That's a really good thing. It doesn't feel like there's much rehashing going on, and okay, there's only so many mechanics that there can be in an MMO, but overall it just feels like they've managed to make every fight feel quite unique. Now, lore-wise, a lot of the guys that you fight are just pretty cool, really. It's not that they're important lore characters, however, you do deal with some important lore people, but, you know, overall, they just feel like cool people to be fighting. It's not like, say, in Stormstout Brewery, where you're going around fighting vermin and elementals, or perhaps the kind of bizarre comedy Klaxi from the Siege of Nuzhou Temple. There's none of that weirdness going on. They're just really solid bosses that are great, and they feel like bosses, they feel like big bad guys, and it's cool. Now, another thing, of course, is, as I said earlier, many bosses do have a lot of very simple yet meaningful mechanics. That just makes the fights feel really cohesive and pretty darn cool. However, some bosses do actually really step it up in terms of the complexity. Now, not massively, not to the point where it's insanely hard, but I think that some of the bosses are certainly really awesome. A good example of one is, in fact, the final boss of Skyreach. This thing is basically a miniature Lich King. It's got Valkyr-style Arakoa mobs that try to pick people up and throw them off the platform. It's got an AoE sort of, like, flame beam thingy that's kind of Blackfuse style, and overall, that's just a really cool fight. The final fight in the Everbloom is also really nice, as is the final fight in the Iron Docks. Basically, there's a lot of cool fights going on. And then also I think the first and the second boss of the Shadowmoon Burial Grounds, again, are really interesting. Like, the second boss has got this thing where he sucks you into a nova, then he splits your soul from your body and makes you kill some, like, spectral thingy, and then after that you need to avoid a big AoE that's really fast-paced. And yeah, just overall, you know, there's some bosses that are nice and easy, and, well, easy to understand anyway, but then there's some bosses which do ramp things up, and that's definitely appreciated. Now, currently the difficulty is overtuned for testing purposes, and that means that we really do get to see the mechanics very much in the fore. Mistakes will get you wiped even in normal dungeons currently, and this really just does allow us as testers to see if the mechanical basics behind these bosses are solid, and I can definitely report that for nearly every single boss, they are. I think the only boss that really stood out to me as being terrible was the third one in Skyreach, but that's essentially it. Okay, so coming in at number 1, we have the fact that the dungeons are actually harder than Mists of Pandaria. Now, the way that they're going to be doing things is a little bit different in Warlords of Draenor. In Mists of Pandaria, you essentially just had your level 100 heroics. You didn't really have any level 100 normal dungeons. However, in Warlords of Draenor, there will be normal level 100 dungeons. What this means is that there's a little bit more headroom for heroics to be difficult. First of all, that means they'll be harder off the bat, but it also means that they hopefully will last a little bit longer as we move throughout the expansion. That really is a good thing, and, you know, just having harder heroics just helps in so many regards. It means that people learn more, it also just means the content's a little bit more engaging and fun. So totally that stuff's all quite well done. Now, of course, they are going to be making the things a little bit easier than they are currently. However, I would expect that they're not going to nerf things overboard based on what they've been saying, and based on the fact that they're actually introducing a new system that sort of gates you out of heroics until you have completed, I think it's a silver proving ground. Now, I know that a silver proving ground isn't too much, but, I think that it's still a very good idea. They're basically just going to make sure, as much as they can, that people can only get into heroics if they sort of know what they're doing, and also they have removed heroic dungeons from the LFR gear progression path. What does all this mean? Well, what this means is that they're not really going to be designing the heroic dungeons as much, you know, for people who are, say, you know, just doing LFRs and things like that. They're going to be designing it for people who actually care about PvE, and are able to just do it in a pug. / you can go in and circumvent the Proving Ground thing if you just have a pre-made group. So overall, this just allows them to make the heroics decently challenging. Now, just to talk really quickly about the current difficulty level for what that's worth. I'm in the beta. Honestly, it's pretty variable between the dungeons, but what I've got to say is that many of the dungeons feel great. They're a lot of fun, and defeating the bosses actually feels quite rewarding. Honestly, I'd say that the heroics should be a little bit harder than what the normals are currently like. They should be a little bit easier than what the current heroics are like. So somewhere in between, but perhaps more leaning on the heroic side of things in terms of difficulty level. And I'd say the normals do need, in many cases, a decent enough nerf. Just a little, well, not massive, but just a little bit to make it puggable, because oddly enough, a lot of pugs actually fail in normals. But still, I think that if they get the difficulty levels right, the the dungeons can be truly fantastic, because correctly tuned difficulty in tandem with the fantastic boss mechanics that I covered earlier means that we should have really engaging dungeons. So there you go, that's my sort of top 7 or 8 whatever reasons as to why I've so far really been enjoying the Warlords of Draenor dungeons. Obviously, it's worth noting that there are not enough of them, as I said at the top of the video. That sucks, but the good news is that Blizzard are considering adding more as the expansion goes on. I would certainly implore them to do that because it just ain't enough. But anyway, that's about it. I'll probably do a quick little update video once they've finished tuning for these dungeons, so I'll let you know what the crack is then. But for now, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.